Alright, the game is The Guns of August, complete with matching Guns of August coffee mug, purchased from wargamememories.com. It's a website that does coffee mugs and mouse pads and I think beer steins of Roger McGowan's artwork from all his different war games over the years. Guns of August, one of his earlier works. I got this on eBay fairly cheaply for an unpunched copy. It's not a difficult game to find, not particularly expensive. One of those early 80s print runs, Avalon Hill. They probably printed 50,000 copies or something of this game. Some insane number that just doesn't exist in the world of wargaming anymore. So as a result, things like Guns of August, or even something that may be a little bit harder to find, unpunched, Empires in Arms, tend to be easier to find, and you're not going to pay a fortune for them. Compared to some more recent titles, say Case Blue, for example, or DAC 2, things from some of those hard to find monster game titles from the gamers. Those are more recent. Case Blue was printed in 2005 or something like that. DAC 2, 2007 maybe. And those are fetching upwards of $250 or more. Because only tiny, tiny print runs were made of those, even though they are considered, fairly well-known and or popular war games. So, wargaming being the tiny niche market that it is. I mean, it's always been a niche market, even when it was quote-unquote big. It's even tinier today than it was back when it was just a regular niche market printing 25,000 copy print runs of games. Nowadays, your average war game that makes it through a P500 list at some place like MNP or GMT will get maybe 3,000 copies in a print run. Bigger ones might get as many as 5,000 copies. Some companies may do even less than 3,000. So that just kind of puts things in perspective now as to how many people are actually buying war games today versus back then. On the other hand, the smaller print runs and a sort of P500 or pre-order system that most wargame publishers use today allows customers to essentially vote with their wallets on the kind of topics that they want to see games about. So they tend to focus more on designer or topic when making their pre-order choices. Whereas back in the Avalon Hill or SPI days, you got what they gave you. So there was no, ooh, this sounds interesting, I'd like to see that. Avalon Hill would release a certain number of games a year, and it would either be something that interested you or it wouldn't. Now I know some of them did, like in the general, would do these sort of feedback things like, oh, hey, here's a list of things that we're planning on publishing. What's the level of interest in this or that thing? So to kind of get some customer feedback on what sort of games they were developing, people might be interested in. But nonetheless, all the development itself and production itself was determined and forecast by the publishers themselves, rather than consumers essentially voting with their wallets before publication, which is what we have today. So. Enough of that. Let's get back to the game itself. I got this mainly because I'm generally interested in World War I games. I played 1914 Twilight in the East, GMT's World War I East Front monster game, and that was a fun experience. My first monster game experience. But it got me interested in more World War I titles. I'm interested in World War I in general as a topic, probably more than World War II even. which is rare for most people, especially wargamers. But I have played a number of World War I games now, such as Paths of Glory to get the CDG angle to it. I played Ted Racer's Great War in Europe Deluxe Edition, which is sort of a combo. GMT released a boxed game of it, but it's a combination of some old magazine games that he did on each of the different fronts in World War One: the Eastern Front, the Western Front, and the Middle Eastern Front. And greatly enjoyed that in typical Ted Racer style. That was fairly simple system with very simple CRTs, which I tend to enjoy. His games, I don't know what the general consensus in the wargaming community is. I mean, I guess his games sell pretty well. Obviously, Paths of Glory is considered a modern classic, even if it's not the type of game that your true Hex Encounter monster gaming grognards would consider a true war game. But I hadn't played all that stuff that I've played for World War One has all been more recent stuff. So I hadn't played any classic World War One stuff, and part of that is because classic World War One games were kind of sparse. World War One as a wargaming topic has kind of seen its renaissance happen more recently, within the past 10 or 15 years. I'm trying to think of when Paths of Glory came out, like late 90s, early aughts maybe. So in the last 15 years or so, we've seen more World War One titles appear as serious wargaming topics, but it's not that they hadn't been done before, or at a serious level, because the Guns of August here itself is a fairly big war game in terms of size and number of counters and things like that. And I don't know, it looks like game components on the back here talks about 800 counters. I was thinking it was more than that, but that's what they've got listed here. And then a fairly large map too, because you're dealing with both fronts in this. And of course, being an Avalon Hill game, the map is mounted. So let's take a look inside. And classic Roger McGowan artwork on the cover. I tend to like this cover, and I'm not really sure why. It's very indicative of McGowan's earlier stuff, where he's got the three circles over a background image of some sort, fairly plain font there at the top, and the sort of Roger McGowan art style where he's cribbed images from other sources, either photographs or other pictures, paintings, drawings, etc. of the era, and then integrated those things into the artwork itself. Like here, he's actually used this before with the guys. I think these are German soldiers advancing through the flowers or tall grass. I don't remember specifically what the image is. Here you can see it's very abstracted. And it looks like he's done watercoloring here for all the artwork over these assembled images, which, like I said, are images taken from other sources that he's then repurposed for the cover. So I enjoy it. That's why I ended up getting a mug with that artwork on there, just because I like the colors of it, kind of striking between the gray of the sky there and then the gold of the field that the soldiers are going through, and then the colors and detail and the I don't know if it's Kaiser Wilhelm there on the cover, or if it's one of the generals. Might be the Kaiser because he's got the little swirly mustaches, but I don't remember exactly. But either way, a very colorful, kind of evocative cover of that particular era and conflict, which I've always enjoyed. Rulebook. Same artwork on the cover there. And for a game that is fairly big, and this is, I noticed, second edition, so I'm not sure if Avalon Hill printed a previous version of this, or if another company did. I know Avalon Hill, for a number of games, would republish titles that have been published by different publishers before. Again, prime example of that, Empires in Arms, which is an Australian design group game that Avalon Hill bought and republished after their initial small print run. So again, typical Avalon Hill rulebook here, dense, tiny text, and then fairly dense. Not sure the quality of these rules yet, as I haven't actually read any of them. That'll come after the unboxing, I guess. There's some various tables in here. I'm not sure. I'll have to check the player aid cards and see if these appear in the player aids also. I guess is probably not. These are all naval unit things, so, or naval tables, which may not be on the typical player aid cards. And then terrain effects chart on the back of the rulebook. I tend to not like it when they put key tables on the backs of the rulebooks like this, mostly because I usually like to have my rulebook open next to the board, to whatever citation in the rules I'm looking up, and I hate having to flip back and lose my place from where I was in the rules to have to make terrain effects chart checks. So I don't think there's a terrain effects chart separately in here. I think that's it on the back of the rulebook. So here's the counter sheets. Just pick the camera up here, be a little easier, get a better angle. Counter sheets here. You've got the upside down. The Germans is your typical dark gray. I think their uniforms. Some games use sort of a greenish gray color for the Germans. Which I think more closely approximated their uniforms at the time. Russia, brown, fairly typical for your World War One. And again, these are typical NATO iconography on here, with your 3 numbers, usually attack, defense, movement at the bottom. So fairly standard. Most of these look like they are army-sized or corps-sized units. No backs on these, interesting. I've read that this is a particularly counter-dense game on the map, just given the scale of it. So, interesting though. I'm surprised that there's nothing on the back. And then here, we've got the Austria-Hungary, sort of a bluish color for them. Dark green for Italy. And in this lighting, it's very difficult to tell apart these various shades of green, but it's kind of an olive green for Italy, a sort of, I don't know, almost teal green for the United States, a dark forest green for Britain, and then kind of a minty green for France. Now, why you wouldn't make France blue in a World War I game, I don't know. Maybe they couldn't get a blue that would differentiate it enough from Austria-Hungary, or what, or maybe they wanted all the allies to be, all the Western Front allies to be some shade of green. Regardless, these are very confusing colors of green. You can tell them apart a little bit better than what you can here on the camera, just looking through the screen. But the United States and the French are particularly very close. They're not as close in person here in actuality, but they are very strange that they have these weird shades of green for all of these different allied powers. Then you got a sheet of markers, looks like lots of trench markers and so forth. Trains, railheads, so forth and so on. And then about a half a counter sheet and a lot of blanks left of some of your minor powers. Looks like you got Romania, Turkey, Bulgaria. Which, funny, Turkey is essentially a minor power here. And the United States, for some reason, has more troops than Turkey does, which is weird given Turkey's importance to the Central Powers. In fact, Serbia here has more troops than Turkey does. Very interesting. Guess we'll have to see how that plays out in the game. Netherlands, Greece, Belgium. And your like turn track counters and things like that. So 4 counter sheets. Yeah, it would be just over 800 counters. They're 280 counters a piece, although half of that 4th sheet is blank. So here are the player aid cards. Very 80G style here with the fold over. So we get a reinforcement schedule. There's your sequence of play, weather, CRT. Doesn't look too bad. I guess there are some naval charts there. Variable entry and so forth. Setup charts in the back. Interesting. They would use the whole side of a double printed card like this for the setup. Usually that's something that gets relegated to the manual, or more recently in this era, the scenario book. Back in the Avalon Hill era, you didn't get a scenario book. You just got one book, and that was it. That's all your rules. Everything else would either be crammed in there, or, as is in the case here, put on one of these cards. And there's another card. Same as the first. Mailers. Reply cards. Subscribe to the General. Once upon a time. And the mounted board. Set the camera down while I set the board up here. In classic Avalon Hill style, the board is mounted, even though it's fairly large. I think it's 4 sections. It looks pretty good for an Avalon Hill board, which didn't always have the SPI Legend. They didn't have SPI Legend Redmond Simonson doing their boards, their maps, which are obviously sort of the classic wargame style map, but not an entirely unpleasant map, very functional. And of course mounted, so it lays very, very flat. But of course, because it's mounted, you've got it broken into 4 pieces, so you get these nice gaps. Whereas with a good paper map, those kinds of gaps could be avoided by overlaying the map sections accordingly over each other. To get a nice seamless fit. Ooh, sorry. But still, this is it's got a very large area that you're dealing with, obviously, with the entire Russian front there. East Prussia, Königsberg. I've seen a lot of fighting along that front there. And then obviously into the Austro-Hungarian front. Carry turn tracks and so forth. Looks like you're tracking things differently on the Eastern Front versus the Western Front, which has a similar replacement track, and it's got its own various tracking over here. And it's interesting that they do the full front all across like this. Like for example, the Great War in Europe Deluxe splits it up into 2 different maps, and you've got differing scales on those maps. The East Front map is set at a different scale than the West Front map, which is a much tighter scale than the East Front. So, but still a decent looking map. Again with your mounted map board gaps there, but we'll see how it works with apparently some pretty dense counter stacks. Everything I've read about the game is the opinions are kind of divided on it. Some people think it's kind of a turkey. Others seem to really like it as a representation of World War One hex encounter tabletop wargaming. So I viewed it as a kind of historical title on the subject, a true classic Avalon Hill title, and so I was interested in trying it out, and I found it for a good price, unpunched. I like to, I'm not averse to buying punched or clipped copies of games, but I enjoy clipping counters, so I tend to look for unpunched or at least unclipped copies that I can clip myself, just because that's one of the things that I enjoy about the hobby, is clipping a game and making them all look tidy. So, if it's a huge price issue, I'm not averse to buying punched copies of games, but I like to get unpunched copies when I can, especially of older games like this, because I like to do these sort of historical unboxings of these old games that people don't do these kind of videos for anymore, and that are hard to do these videos for, especially because not many unpunched copies of these games are left in the world. So I'll tend to try and hunt down unpunched copies when I can, just because it also gives me control over how neatly the counters are punched out. Sometimes you get people that look like they've hacked them out of these counter sprues with a machete or something. They're just, the counters are just in terrible shape, and so you have to go in with an X-Acto and clean up edges and big tufts of stuff hanging off of them, or tears, or any number of other less than subtle ways in which people have yanked their counters out of the counter trees. So anyway, there we have it. That's a look at the Guns of August inside the box. Not sure when I'll get this one to the table, but obviously I've got some punching and clipping to do. But I would like to get to it sometime in the next couple of months, just because we're coming up on the centenary of the Great War. So it'd be exciting to kind of play something while all of that sort of ceremony is going on.